Yeah, sounds good. Live in 10 seconds. Enjoy. Have a good time.
You
Uh,
too.
it's a great community, the Dev Days. So yeah, enjoy your time.
Will do.
Hello, everyone. We're back on this brilliant team session with Kris van der Mast. He's solution architect at Vaha, and he will talk with us about a really important topic: documentation. The things you don't want to write, right? We know we're all familiar with just read the code. My code is great. It's self-documenting, whatever. Chris will tell us how he managed that and how, from his experience, what we can learn from documentation. Hello, Chris. How are you? How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. It's sunny outside. I just noticed in Belgium, so which is always good. Lifts up the spirits. I hope it's also equally sunny at your side, or at least nice weather. And to all the people who are attending, have a nice day, and I hope you will enjoy the presentation. It will most likely not last for 45 minutes full, but I hope that there's going to be some questions. So please ask questions, and my co-host will put them up to me, or just ask. You can interrupt me. I will not always take a direct look at the chat window because I'm sharing on the same screen, and I know there's like a 20-second delay, as I've been told. So just keep that in mind, and let's enjoy the ride.
Yeah,
Okay.
I will be here to ask the question. So for everyone attending, you can ask the question in the Q&A section or in the chat, and I will love to transfer him to Chris. Chris, are you able to share your slides with us so we can
Of
see
course
or
I
the
will.
screen or the screen?
Let me share my screen, and let's get pumping up. Okay. You should be able to see my screen right now.
We can see we just have a small button like sharing, hide sharing slides below. If you're able to hide
Okay.
it,
Okay.
that's
Yeah,
perfect.
super. This is
Stage is
better?
yours. Stage is yours. We'll be back for questions.
All right, super. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this session about the stuff you don't want to write. Uh, but before we start, let me allow me to introduce myself. I'm Kris van der Mast. I have my own website, of course. I'm also a bit on Twitter, as long as Elon Musk, who recently bought it, doesn't kick people out. I have my own small company, which is called Vaha BVBA. I usually work for big international companies, and where I try to do like solution architecture, sometimes helping out the enterprise architects, and try to integrate several teams. I currently work in several teams in a safe way. So basically, there's like 8 or 9 squads working together on several huge projects for several years, which is quite enticing. I think it's like 45 developers at the moment involved. Also international, so not only in Belgium, but also Mauritius, Poland, and also Finland since recently, I believe. So yeah, that's pretty cool. I'm a Microsoft Mobile professional since 2007. I started as an ASP.NET MVP, and since 2016, I became an Azure MVP. So I'm mostly focusing on Azure on that one. I'm also an ASP insider for Microsoft. I'm one of the board members of the Belgian Azure user group. And every year, well, of course, not with COVID now, but this year it's going to be happening again. Luckily, we're doing our own conference called Cloud Brew, because cloud computing and Belgian beer brewing, because that's something else that we like to do. So hence Cloud Brew. It's going to be this year in November. So if you want to come over, you're happy to join us. So our session, the stuff you don't want to write. And it's basically documentation, because documentation is always needed, but nobody likes to write, myself included in the past. So basically, this session is going to be about what's basically documentation, how we're going to see it, based also on this session, a bit more specific, why we should write documentation, who should write it, when, and how we could approach it. And let's get started on that one. So first, what is documentation? So I took the liberty to take something from Wikipedia. Documentation is any communicable material that's used to describe, explain, or instruct. And it can be either digital or analog, such as audio tape and CDs. I think, well, CDs has been a long time since I used that one. I don't even have a CD player or DVD player in my laptops anymore. Analog media, well, basically books or printouts, or I wouldn't say audio tape. That's also been quite some time, even though I know on mainframe they still use a lot of backup tapes. So yeah, there's a lot of things which is being like documented, and basically anything can be documentation. Like whenever my wife writes a small piece of paper to go to the grocery shop, that is also some kind of documentation. Of course, we're in developer days, 2022, and this session is going to be mostly about technical documentation because basically I'm a solution architect, but I've been more than 20 years in the development scene. I still develop, by the way. Um, so yeah, documentation, it's also always one of those things that's always falling off the first thing, besides unit tests, of course. So this session is going to be mainly focusing on technical documentation. Why should we write documentation? As you can see here, I took the liberty of sometimes taking some pictures from the internet, and I put the copyright from where I got it from, and the lower either left or right. So I'm just be sure to be covered over there. So here on this picture, you see already people talking in different languages, like French, Spanish. I think it's Italian. Salam is Arabic, according to me. Guten Tag is German, and hello, well, it could be either English or it could also be my own native language in Dutch. But you already see, like, yeah, why do you write documentation? First of all, to document and describe things for people who don't speak always the same language. Usually, for technical documentation, I noticed that we try to tend to go to either Dutch, our own language, but as companies grow, and remember, I work mostly for large enterprises who are international, we tend to make use of the English language to write documentation. And it's not only to know, like, to be able to communicate to one another, but it's also like typical. Whenever someone leaves a team, it's kind of a brain drain if there's no documentation. And that person usually gets called afterwards, like, hey, how did you do this? How did you set up that? If you're lucky, that person is still available in the company or just switch teams. But there's always like some barrier, even if that person migrated. I recently migrated myself to another team temporarily. But sometimes you still get questions, but yeah, you get overlap in meetings with other teams. So it's a bit difficult. So writing or leaving at least some kind of documentation is always a good thing. Also for yourself sometimes, like for example, I'm usually kind of forgetful of like where are all the hyperlinks to our log files or whatever. So I started making up a wiki, basically our documentation, like where can I easily find everything again. It's just like a mental treadstone for myself. I also just heard when before this talk about the Eaglestorm theory, like if you didn't touch it for the last 6 months, it basically it's written by something else, by someone else, even though you wrote it yourself. So basically, it's also like your own memory, keeping it sane, because people do forget, myself included, by the way. So it's also for me my mental ease. Like, yeah, why do I write documentation? And usually what I see, especially at could be any corporation, like either ranging from very small or very large, is that it's usually one person or perhaps two people who write the documentation. And that's mainly like the analyst, because that person has been there since the beginning and hopefully also at the end of the project still, or some developer, especially when it's deep dive technical documentation, like setting up databases or setting up security or Azure pipelines or whatever. So it's usually that one specific person. And when? It's usually at the end, especially in waterfall scenarios. I started in 2000, and back then everything was still waterfall. I still know teams currently who do waterfall, so not everyone jumped on the agile bandwagon yet. So it's usually done at the end of the project by one or perhaps two people who have at their best knowledge at that moment in time. Of course, if a certain project has been running for several years, some people might have come in, might have left, and not everything is, well, clear in the brain. So that's usually not always the best time. And sometimes I end up joining, well, some small team or another team in a large enterprise, and there's nothing, or just some tumbleweed. in the best case, there's like some Word document that was written like 7 years ago and that's lying around on some shared server. Yeah, that's not always the best scenario to start in. And then usually I get to hear like, yeah, but our code is a documentation, read the code. Okay, but does your code say like how to set up a SQL database, for example, to be able to start and press F5 and just get running on your code? Most probably not. That's kind of information that you want to have, basically. And usually, I also notice that this is like SharePoint, but could be any other documenting system, of course, that your company uses. Yeah, it's written down somewhere in a Word document and with some obscure title. For example, project charter in this case. This is not a thing that I took from the internet. This is not a thing at my company, of course, but you get the basic ID. So basically, someone wrote some Word document and it's being put somewhere on SharePoint or some other documentation system, and it's there, like we wrote documentation. After half a year, if everyone of that team is gone and you try to start looking for documentation, you already found the code, but documentation is like, yeah, okay, perhaps someone wrote something down, but it's hard to find. So this is usually not the best place to put documentation, especially technical documentation about your applications. So how could we improve? Basically, we want everyone in the team to write documentation, and not just the developers or the analysts or those people, but also people from our product owner in an agile system, or a test QA, or perhaps someone from the business side. So this is basically, we want to involve everyone. Basically, all the agile mindset is about the chicken and the pork. The stories most probably like you try to make people more involved. Writing documentation should also be involve more people than just like one or perhaps two of people of the team at the end of a project. So try to involve everyone. And that's basically what I'm now currently doing and seeing, luckily, because it's spreading viral at my current customer. I started up with something, and we'll demo that later on, how I got into that. And my colleagues picked it up because for them, it was also like a new way of doing things. And now I'm starting to see like other teams are also doing that independent from us because they notice like, hey, that team where Kris is working in, this is basically working. And perhaps we should try do something similar. And now I'm getting questions from the business people like, hey, Kris, we noticed that you wrote some interesting things. It looks very nice. Could you teach us how to do it? We're also looking into this. So it's becoming a bit more viral. So that's something that I want to show you. If you want to go to your company again and take something from this session, this is something that I want you to take out from this session. It's like everyone should be involved, or at least more people should be involved into writing documentation and keeping it up to date, because that's also a big thing. Once I usually notice, like 7 years ago, someone wrote a document, but it's never been updated, even though that the current situation in life, in the world, has changed dramatically over the last several years. Like 5 years ago, nobody would have predicted like a big war in Europe, or the last 2 years of a COVID pandemic. So things do change. Keep your documentation also up to date, depending on the current situation, or try to keep it up to date as much as possible. It is responsible for everyone, not just like one or two people who are still involved in a team. So when do you do it? Instead of just like at the end or totally not at all, what I also saw is we are working in an agile world, most of the teams nowadays that I work with. It's either Kanban or it's Scrum, and this is why I put here the sprint on top. So we work now currently in a safe way with 8 or 9 squads at the moment. And the safe way is basically like you have like huge sprints for all the teams per quarter, like 13 weeks, usually reduced to 12 weeks, and then 1 week of cleaning up some things and doing demos, etc., and all the ceremonies. And then every squad on its own uses Scrum, basically working in 2 weeks sprints and doing all the ceremonies, like most people are used to, I guess. So if you're doing a sprint and you're adding value by creating new codes, adding new uh, business logic, deploying, potentially upgrading some Azure pipelines, setting up SQL databases, or deploying or fixing bugs or whatever, writing unit tests, why not make writing documentation part of your sprint? The reason why, your memory is still fresh on the task at hand. Say, for example, if I wrote a very difficult piece of business logic, or I'm just setting up some extra pipelines and I want to communicate that to my colleagues. When I'm doing it, I basically have it fresh in memory because I've been busy with it all day or perhaps a couple of days. So why not write documentation at that particular moment in time? That's usually easier said than done. And most of the people go like, yeah, but we have other things to do. And that is correct. And just like unit tests, which are always the first thing to fall off from a project, even though everyone says like, yeah, we're writing a lot of unit tests. Then some project manager passes by like, yeah, this is more important. So those things fall off. Now, the thing that we did is we make it part of the definition of done. A task user story on the Scrum board is only done if not only unit tests have been written or updated, but also a piece of information, basically like documentation, has been written or at least updated or checked. We also use, we work usually with branches on Azure DevOps, and we're not allowed by default to directly make a pull request on or commit to the master or to the main branch. So there's at least always someone who needs to double check what someone else has written in the team. And well, most of the teams, well, there are some teams, for example, at the Safeway that have a different implementation of that. Some lead or senior developer takes care of the reviewing process. Well, that's all good and nice. That depends on the Scrum team, of course. The teams that I work with, I usually give the property like everyone can review, ranging from the most senior developer or architect in my case to the complete junior. Everyone should be able to look through the code. If that person doesn't feel perfectly fine, like, hey, this is too difficult for me to actually review, I cannot approve, just say in the Teams chat or something like, hey, I looked into it, but I'm having problems with this. This also gives the opportunity to notice like, there's a person in need. Perhaps we should, during a next stand-up or just take another meeting aside with that person to introduce him or her to that new piece of code or extra functionality. So this is also a very good way to basically have better team integration. It also increases team spirit, by the way, I noticed. So that's also a very nice thing. So our definition of done is basically like a checklist, nothing more. You can read here the official documentation about it. What's the definition of done? Basically, it's nothing more than a checklist like, hey, did you do this? You wrote code, you checked it, you deployed it, you wrote unit tests, you did some regression tests, for example, sanity checking to see if nothing is exploding in the face when you're opening on the application, and also did some documentation. And once it's in there, it's an official thing. You can print it out, hang it out in the office, or put it somewhere, of course, also on a wiki. And then, everyone else knows like, hey, this is part of the definition of done. This is how we do things around here. And documentation is a major part about it. Now, what I introduced to my colleagues is basically Markdown. Markdown is a very handy and very easy, and that's an important one. I'll get to that later on. Tooling, it's a way of writing down documentation. So it's quite easy to learn. And the important thing about that is also that business people can learn it very easily. We also make use of mermaids to make graphs, and I will also show you some samples about that. And well, we use Azure DevOps. Most of my customers, they are Microsoft focused. So we make use of Azure DevOps. I know that other vendors also have weekly possibilities. I think GitHub also, since a couple of months, has integration for Mermaid. I don't know about Bitbucket because it's been very long since I use it, or other systems which are more into the Java or the Python world. But for Azure DevOps, I know it's working. Not fully as much as I would like to, because there's some things that are not fully working yet, but they're getting there. So it's very nice to see that integration as well. Okay, so let's try to get into some demos. By the way, if there are already questions, I will switch now to the chat window. And let's see.
Yeah, we have a question like, what things good documentation should have?
I don't see. What can I have the chat?
Yeah, Victoria, if you can hear me, there you are. We have some first question from Victoria. What things, properties, in a sense, good documentation should have?
It should be easy to read, easy to maintain. It should be on topic, preferably up to date. It should be easily readable by everyone. So it can either be like extremely technical, of course, because we're now focusing mostly on the technical part. So that's more for like developers or people who are deep hardcore technical. But regular things like, for example, people coming outside of the team, they should kind of know like, if I go to this part of the team, there I can find information, get at least like an index or a general thing. What I also like to set up on every team or every application is like how to get started. Because the thing that I also noticed a lot is like, you start usually with a small team on a new project, right? Greenfield, or sometimes you get into a certain project. And then you want to basically like get started with the code. Say, for example, we had like, in my current team, we had my former team, I quickly switched the team. So in a couple of weeks, I'm switching back to that former team. We started like 3 years ago and was a small team. And then more and more people got added later on. Also senior developers, but also junior developers in another country. And it was not always clear. For us, it was clear because we set things up in the beginning. And then I noticed like, hey, but what if someone else comes into the team? And I remember when I was in other teams, and they say like, here's the code. Okay, you make a git clone of the repo, and then you start pressing F5 in the solution when you open it in Visual Studio, and then some things are not working. It turns out to be like, for NService, you need to make up a SQL database. You have to add security for that user. And this is also something that I like to write down in documentation. And I also prefer to have it like double checked when someone else from the team or someone coming outside of the team to our team, like, hey, follow these steps, the getting started. If you can do it on your own, then it's good documentation for that particular thing. And turned out to be, we already had that for my former team. We already had that a couple of times that new people came in from Mauritius, both a senior and later on a junior developer. They were able to follow the steps and basically also improve it a little bit with their own things like, I noticed this or this on my laptop. This is a nice addition. So basically, they were already starting to add value to our documentation, adding value to the team, even though they're a complete fresher, either from school or just new in the team. So I think that that proves the strength on that part of documentation. Is that enough for the question? Because I don't apparently see the questions here.
There's a Q&A section. We have another question like, how would you fast changing product environment? For example, when it would take a lot of time to keep it up to date.
Well, that's why I say like whenever you start writing your code, basically making like a small bug fix or whatever, write down the documentation and make a commit from both side by side with your code, and then make a pull request on that one. So basically it becomes like, with the definition of done, basically it becomes like one single unit of commitment of not only writing the bug fix and hopefully also writing some unit tests to make sure that there's no regression later on. But also writing or at least updating the documentation like, hey, I fixed this or this or this. Um, Sometimes we also have like a logbook next to our documentation because sometimes we have like those big whiteboarding discussions for like half a day or that one day that we come to the office physically because most of the time everyone's working from home or from a nearby location. So we try to get together nowadays once per week or once every 2 weeks. And if there's like huge discussions and later on like some decision after a couple of hours of debating sometimes, we also try to document them as well because we noticed in the past like, yeah, a year ago we decided on this, but what was the exact outcome again? Because someone else might have something else in their mind, like during the discussion, you know how those things go. And when it's written down, then you know, like I can take it out my brain, and it's somewhere written down. And this was our decision from a year ago. Like, why did we do A or B?
Yeah, totally makes sense. You said you want a question. Do you want? Will you share something, or can we again, or can we ask more question?
You can ask more questions if you want to.
No, yeah. There is a famous saying in design where it said, "When it's not logical, it's historical." It was a good decision at the time, but we lost documentation about it. So now we don't understand this decision anymore, right? Do
Mm.
like how do you compensate that with documentation? When someone, for example, leaves a company, like how are you sure that everything is documented? At least he doesn't go with the whole knowledge, so the future teams can.
Yeah, that's basically what I want to get to. My like what I see usually is like basically there's yeah at the end there's one or two people who have hopefully most of the knowledge, the right documentation. Unfortunately, what I usually also see is that usually those people are the senior developers of that team, but they're overly asked because there's like yeah a shortage on people, and yeah other teams want to grab that person, and then documentation is left in a hurry or nothing at all, and indeed there's like a brain drain. And that's why I proposed to my teams, and I noticed that other teams are picking it up at the company. And I also noticed that I also talked with some other people from other companies, and they're trying to do this similar thing. Um, Basically, when you write something, try to document it directly, and not just in code, because yeah, the code is self-defining, of course, or writing documentation inside the code, but basically like yeah, decision A or B has been taken due to this reason, and then just put it like in a logbook. Um, like in a yeah in a ledger for the team, just to prevent like yeah because people like for example I just got back from a very short holiday. I was kind of hoping that my colleague would do something during my absence. Turns out to be he now unfortunately has a burnout. uh, yeah, his code wasn't checked in. Like one of my other colleagues had to call him like, hey, what's the deal, how are you going, but also please can you check in your code so that other people can work on it. uh, that's an unfortunate thing. People get sick, people pass away, unfortunately, or they get hijacked by another company for a better paycheck. I think there's no so, or just to another team in the best case. But yeah, that's how things go. So, and also when you wrote a piece of code more than 6 months ago, there's that famous meme like, yeah, when I wrote this piece of code, only me and God could understand. Now it's only God that understands. So that's why I'm saying like as soon as you write down something, either like a piece of code or a bug fix, or you add value to the team, or you change something which is yeah very hard to understand perhaps, or perhaps you just want to keep like a mental memory, write it down. Okay, so hopefully, okay, do you think it's better that every developer should write documentation themselves, not using any tools, or use tools for generating documentation? Um, well, I'm very familiar with those tools, like for example, like GhostDoc that easily make XML documents, documentation in your code. I'm usually not such a huge fan of it. I tend to try not to write too much documentation in the code itself, because code changes quite rapidly sometimes. Um, and if it's not very easy to understand, and that's why I like those peer checks by yeah fellow developers. First of all, to notice, for example, if a junior developer sees some piece of code during a pull request review that he or she cannot fully grasp, like, hey, this is too difficult for me, then it's a very clear sign for like, let's get that person up to date or up to speed with this piece of information like letting him read or her read a piece of documentation from Microsoft, for example, or watching a Pluralsight course, or just have like, this was set up for this and this specific reason by our team. We can do it like this. So I hope that kind of covers it. For the documentation, I tend to write it myself personally in a more easy to grasp information, like, and I would like to get to like a demo on how we could potentially set that up, how we did it in our team. I hope that answered the questions.
Yeah, we also have a question. What do you think a changelog for documents? You know, can be extremely useful, especially for documents that need to go through an official review wall and approval procedure.
Okay. Let me think about that one. Basically, the documentation that we tend to write is like, yeah, peer reviewed. It's close to our code. Basically, it lives alongside in our code, in our code base, in the same solution. People from business can also review it, can take things out, can add things if they want to on Azure DevOps. And some people are even becoming a bit versed in making a Git clone and updating with the commits in Visual Studio Code, because those people don't have admin rights, but they apparently can ask for a exception to have it installed by Visual Studio Code then, and it's a very easy tool to make use of. So for the change log, well, basically the documentation that we write is also in Git, so there's also like a full background and merges and etc. So just like of your code. That makes it easy to see like, hey, this has been, and you can make like diffs if you want to. So that's kind of makes it easy, like, this person wrote this piece of documentation on that date. It's just, yeah, you can use the same blame tooling like with your code.
Then you should document the commits, right? Don't put just just put like.
Yeah, I'm not always the best one on that one, because sometimes I call it TC, for example, for a commit, like temporary commits or something, like if I want to quickly check in and then push something. Yeah, I should still work on that one, I guess.
It's a continuous process. So we still have like a 30 minute together. Do you have some content again to share, or can we continue for questions?
If there are still questions, we can do, and otherwise I will. I have some small things that I can show, or I can show it from scratch. So basically, on how the questions roll. So if there are still questions or debates, because now I give my opinion about writing documentation or how we could improve it. But I'm very eager to learn from the audience, of course. Like, hey, what's your thought about it? So let's try to make it like a bidirectional, if possible.
Yeah, we have no more direct question from the audience. I will just ask maybe one that I've heard often is that, do you recommend Docs Writer working with developers, or like to have some distance, so the developer has to explain, and so the Docs Writer can
Um,
really write for reuse, because the developer may write for use, but the Docs Writer may write for other to reuse, and sometimes it's a different job.
Yeah, indeed. I think you're now referring a bit more to like for externals, for customers, for example, and that's better not done by developers, I guess, because those people need to focus on adding new business value. So it depends a bit on the teams. I worked in the past with a couple of teams that had like a dedicated person that would really sit down next to a developer or an architect and like, hey, let's see what this product can do. And then it's more about product documentation. And that's, I think, indeed better done by a different person. But as I said, it could also be someone from business. For example, now in my current environment, there are people from the business who actually also write that type of documentation and then later on grasp from the technical documentation or documentation that people write alongside their code, that they also try to distill. They make the swap between like what's purely technical and what's of value for business users, for example, who are totally non-technical people. They just know, uh, those people know very well how to work with the products, sometimes better than the developers itself. But yeah, they're not deep dive technical, so they don't know how to set up, like, for example, like a database or whatever. And they also don't have to care about such things. But you need indeed, at least in such a case, a person that can understand a bit of both worlds. So yeah, it could make sense. At the moment, we don't use it because we're in a full expansion development. But there are other teams and those who maintain the servers, etc. And they also start using the same type of documentation on Markdown. And yeah, so it's very nice to see that those people are also making use of it. I know from a friend of mine who used to work at Mast, the big shipping company. They had the idea like, yeah, we have 10 enterprise architects, very knowledgeable people. They write documentation about certain frameworks, etc. And we have like 3,000 engineers making use of those documentation, etc. How can we include those people? So basically, they also start with a similar way of writing down documentation, because basically you're making use of the knowledge of 3,000 extra people to do reviews. Basically, what they do is like they also write documentation. They make a pull request, and when that person, it has to go through a rigorous review, of course. And if one of those enterprise architects notes like, hey, this is a very good addition to our documentation, we can publish it onto our main branch and have like a wiki made out of it. So basically, it's also tapping not just into the knowledge of 1 or 2 people, or 10 people in this example, but making use of the knowledge, the shared knowledge, the common knowledge of thousands of people. And that's something that I think is very interesting on an enterprise level. Also because some people know a lot of things from A, but not so much from B. And now you're combining all that knowledge. So
Yeah, makes sense. So we have 10 minutes, 8 minutes, if you want to share something. We don't have any more questions from the audience. So you can either share some experience, feedbacks, or share a screen to show something.
okay. What I wanted to show, let's quickly see up. I think I made here something. Let me quickly see. So wait, let me share my screen again. Okay, so first of all, what I created was a simple. You know what? How much we have? Like 8 minutes left. Let's just try something new. Let's just create a new repository. Make it on Git. I am here on Azure DevOps. Let's give it a repo name. Let's say, for example, demo dev days 2022. I'm adding a README, and I'm making use of Visual Studio. So let's make it over here. And let's say create. All right. So now I can clone this. And let's start a new Visual Studio in this case. And I can clone a repository. I'm going to clone this one. Let's say demo dev days 2022 should be okay. Okay, it's taking a little bit more time than I expected. Okay. Let's get one over here. Let's hide this one. Hello. See my Visual Studio is kind of a bit slow. Let's open this one. Okay. Copy the path and start writing some new project. I can start here from a class library. I'm going to call this docs because basically that's always a good thing. Let's put it into this location and create a new solution. And let's call this, for example, my application. Let's call it like this. Okay. This is not that much important because we're not going to use any of those codes. But I just want to get into a class library called documentation. So this class.cs I can already take out. This is usually done by the first time. Yes, I can take this one out. Thank you very much. And here I can start writing a index, for example. I can add a new thing, like a new text file. And let's call that, for example, index.md for Markdown. Now, there's a whole very easy to make use of Markdown. And that's one of the beauties, like basically you start basically with writing some Markdown code. It's very easy to learn. We're a bit on time here, so for those people who don't know how to write Markdown, there is some like, let's go quickly here and let's say, for example, make use of our Google with all trusted trend, and let's say Markdown for beginners. And for example, oops, sorry. So as you can see, there's quite some interesting things. You can also look up it on GitHub, etc., like how to make use of things. Yes, we agree. I'm going to click this one away. So how to write headings, etc. This is basically what I also give to people from business, for example. And the nice thing is that it's quite interesting. Let's get rid of all the commercials, etc. So it's quite easy to understand, right? Super. So this is Markdown. Okay. Someone wants to buy shoes, apparently. Cool. So basically, we got here to our application. I wrote some okay. So this is basically how we could do it. So in here, I installed some Markdown extension. We can also make use of Visual Studio Code, which on some parts is actually even better to write documentation than this one. But I just want to make sure of here. I'm here on the main branch. So I can do a first commit over here. And as discussed, sometimes I really need to make sure that I have enough more documentation in my commit statements, of course, like added index wiki page. So this commit all and push. Okay, this is now going up to Azure DevOps. Let's see this. Okay, super. Now I can go back to my app over here. So I'm here on demo days. If I go and take a look at the file, so hopefully now here my documentation has been added. So this is my index.md. I can also preview it over here. But because we're now basically all working on the same Scrum board, on the same documentation, on the same code base, I can also add a wiki. And as you can see here, I already added several from some test projects. But I can do here like a publish code as wiki. What I'm going through now is add my, I called it Demo Dev Days 2022. I'm on my main branch. I'm going to select a folder, and it's going to be this one, the docs. I'm going to publish it. Okay, so basically this is my wiki now at the moment that I can share with other people. Other people can add things. They can make like a Git clone repo and make some commits, hopefully peer reviewed, of course. I didn't add peer reviewing at the moment for demo purposes. But say, for example, if someone from business or my PO, because sometimes she also does some, add some extras, she can also either, if she doesn't install Visual Studio Code, she can also make use of editing repos and start adding some things over here, for example. And of course, click the edit button. That's something that I always forget. And start adding things over here. Now, that's pretty nice.
We have 1 more minute. One last minute.
One more minute. Okay, then I'm going to quickly show another wiki where I wanted to get to. I didn't expect so many questions. Thank you for that, by the way, to the people. So let's quickly go here to, I think I had it here, no. As you can see over here, I added some documentation, some mermaid diagrams, which is basically nothing more. As you can see, we have quite some interesting things. And this is basically, this one and this one, I basically took from our current documentation, from our own application. So these are the sequence diagrams, it's just like a flowchart, like, hey, this come in, and these are the steps. And the way that you write that is basically like adding code like this. So that diagram that you just saw with all those alt operations, it's nothing more than three columns over here, mermaid, and then adding a sequence diagram, and then adding these code. And then, of course, for the last graph that we showed is one over here. You can quickly go over here, and basically there's an entire website about it, mermaid.js, where you can find all kinds of documentation, all kinds of interesting things. Let's see here for like, for example, flowcharts, sequence diagrams, etc. So you can go very nuts with these things. Mention up front, on Azure DevOps, not everything is working. There are certain diagram things that don't work yet over there. So they need to update their Mermaid installation over there, I noticed. So this was basically what I wanted to get to. Hopefully it was a bit interesting. The nice thing is that people from business also now learned how to write these sequence diagrams, and they're actually using it. So that's kind of to describe their processes at the moment. So it's quite interesting to see that those people are easily picking up those things as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kris, for this last minute demo on the live. Trying something new. Yeah, I hope
Okay.
everyone, you enjoyed the session from Kris. We will end the session and we'll be back in a few minutes for the next session in the Brilliant Teams track. Thank you very much, Kris, for having been with us.
Okay, thank you all for joining. If you want to reach out, just write to chris@azig.be or follow me on Twitter on Kris Mast. I'll try to to explain everything and then get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the rest of Dev Days. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.